All right, everyone, if I can have your attention again. I just want to let you know that we're having our last lecture before our break, which will be from noon to 1:10. And after this talk is when we have some space carved out to have you ask questions. We're trying to see if we can get a hand mic to give to you because of the sheer space of the room. So, yes. Oh, we've got one. Wonderful. So again, if you have questions for any of our three speakers, just make a note of them and you'll have a period after this next talk. I also just wanted to briefly thank Elaine for taking us on that behind-the-scenes tour and reminding me of how much work the Kelsey Museum put into the exhibit so that the Museum of the Rockies could use it as our foundation. It's extraordinary what we did and were able to do because of the work that they had done. And I even think that she didn't mention generating all of the labels and text materials, all of that intellectual product that went with everything else. We're just so grateful to have had your careful stewardship so that we could be the next phase. So a heartfelt thank you for that. Our third and final speaker is Tim Liddell, and I have to say just now, we were talking about what it's like to be in the audience and see unexpected photos of yourself pop up that you didn't know were taken. And I found myself thinking, and Tim, you're in all of them because you did everything for us. He was our go-to person for so many reasons, and it's such a pleasure to introduce him today. So our third speaker before the break is Tim Liddell. He is an architect of Liddell Projects, LLC, and he is a graduate student in product design for innovation at the Politecnico di Milano in Italy. The paper title that he has for us today is Bricks to Bits and Back Again, the Modern Incarnation of an Ancient Roman Villa. Tim?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Is this working? Can you hear it all right? Thank you, Regina. My biggest thank you really goes to Regina for putting this show together and bringing our whole team here to Bozeman. It's a beautiful place, and you've done something really special here. You just saw what we had in Michigan and Ann Arbor, and it's really interesting to see the same objects on display here in a different way, and also to learn how you've interacted with the show and continue to interact with it through your classes and this conference. So, thank you, Regina. Another thank you to John and Michael. They're the leaders of the Aplantis project, and I was very lucky to be invited to work with them when I was still actually an undergraduate. And a thank you to Elaine, who really built this show and had the ambition to build the little Cubiculum 11. And that got me really involved with the show, and I learned a lot through that, so thank you. As Regina said, I am an architect practicing recently with Caesar Pelli doing towers overseas. I have my own small firm, but this project has occupied me over many summers, many evenings and weekends, and has been really a pleasure. So today the talk is really kind of an overview of my involvement, a series of projects that I've been asked to really collaborate on. So other scholars, all the PhDs on the Aplantis project team, will ask me to help visualize or explore a topic, and then so I get to see it all. I'm curious, though, out of the audience, how many architects or artists do we have, by a show of hands? Okay, good, so I'm not alone. How many programmers or software people? Any engineers? Okay, so there's a mix, and I hope that my talk in particular will show you how you might get involved with a project like this. You don't need to be a PhD art historian to engage with the materials. So in your classes this semester, but also through your careers, I hope you find opportunities to explore this stuff. So jumping in here, I'm going to start with just a quick introduction to the site if there are any newcomers to the talks today. We're located in southern Italy, in the Bay of Naples, in the center of what was the Roman Empire. And it's important to understand the context, both ancient and current, because when we deal with a modern site, these things are interwoven. So we look at walls and we have to determine what was modern and what was ancient. And that's a process that's ongoing. This is not just an object that can be revealed in its entirety. It's really a place that needs to be explored. And that's why the topic of this conference is so appropriate to call this the genius loci, because it's the spirit of the place, and it's nuanced. And I think, I hope that through this talk you'll see some aspects of that spirit. So you've seen this, Mount Vesuvius. We're located between the famous sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum, a smaller site, but obviously a very interesting one. And this is taken from a modern apartment building overlooking the site of Aplantis Villa A. And you can see Vesuvius in the distance there. And as John noted earlier, it's really important to remember that this is in the middle of a busy, bustling city, and it's below the street level by quite a lot. So the context has changed dramatically. And when you get down into the site, you'll see what has been revealed, about half of a massive villa. And it's still very chock full of objects and paintings and floors that are very interesting. So those of you who have been to site know this. If you ever make it there, you'll see many of these things. But the point I want to make here at the start of my talk is to show you just what's missing or what's out of context. So in that view that you just saw, you have the apartment buildings, the trees. You have to remember that in antiquity, we were on the ancient coastline. So that wouldn't have been there. There would have been open views to the sea. So if you remove that, it changes the picture a little bit. You also should remember that this is only partially excavated. So when you're down in this hole, you're surrounded by soil. And that obviously wouldn't have been there either. So you have to remove that. The landscape would have been full of garden and field and active agriculture. So what we see today is not necessarily accurate. And then there are all these things that they had to do when they excavated and reconstructed this site for the protection and preservation of floors and walls and frescoes. So they've actually added a number of roofs over atria that would have otherwise been open. So some aspects of the experience on site are not accurate in the strict sense. So you might be there covered with a metal roof when in antiquity they would have been open to the sky or had a tree. So you would remove those things as well. So in the end, you end up with sort of a piece of ancient history embedded in this large, basically modern site. So I return to the topic of genius loci and ask you, what does that mean here, and where is genius loci? Because I would argue that it's not solely located in Torre Annunziata. Actually, a good portion of it is right here in Bozeman during the show. And also, we could say that it's online in the form of the publications of the Aplantis Project. So through this conversation, I think we're going to identify aspects of it, and I'll wrap up my talk with a question, really, which is how could we sort of weave these elements back together, or how could we learn from one aspect of the genius loci that's here, the material culture, and then better understand the site that we have in Italy. So this is that dynamic, going from bricks to bits and back again, being on site, documenting the site in a number of ways through surveying tools, spending good time on the computer, modeling this stuff, and then testing out ideas. So we're always looking at potential hypotheses and evaluating those and trying to eliminate sort of all the mistakes and to come to a better conclusion. And that, ultimately, all of that body of work has been fed into the show. So what you're seeing in the show was a culmination of a lot of different scholars' input and sort of a refinement of the body of material that we received when we arrived on site back in 2006. So this is the first of my examples, one that John has referenced already, but this was actually my first summer on site. John had found a whole collection of what he calls orphan fragments, and they had been sort of put in storage or discarded in a storage room and were not on view to the public. And when we got a hold of them, well, this is what that storeroom looks like, or looked like. It has since been cleaned up, and John has photographed just about every one of those. But this first batch of frescoes were quite large and were unwieldy to position and to sort of reposition as we worked through the puzzle and the connections between each piece. So digitizing them was necessary, scaling them and putting them in a digital workspace, in this case, Adobe Illustrator. And then over the course of a couple days, thinking about their relationships internally, and then going on site to the room that they had been found in, and trying to identify connections to that room. So this is the wall on the west of the atrium. This is what you would see if you went there today. And this is actually a construction that had been done previous to the Atlantis project, where they had taken these pieces and sort of imagined this large architectural, reconstruction. Truth be told, they were off by a bit. So this is the internal relationship of these pieces that you see in your show. But I want to highlight also, oops, I got ahead of myself. I want to highlight the connection with the site. And this is what's important about being there, so to speak. That genius loci is when you're there, you often find clues on site that you wouldn't have seen in a photograph. So we noted the column base just at the top of the original painting. And we were able to correspond that to sort of a ghosted column capital that we knew because of a little flying salamander and a little handle, and those sorts of clues allowed us to position this thing in the upper right of this large wall. And that actually allowed us to determine the ceiling height of the atrium and a whole number of other things that helped to inform and improve upon the digital model. So that work was sent to a team in England that was doing these reconstruction images, and we were able to do what I would argue is a much more accurate reconstruction of that wall. And also colored in a way that really brings it to life. And that's also seen in the exhibition. Okay, so another example, or another storyline here is the digital model, which you've heard a little bit about. I'll explain it from my point of view as a surveyor and an architect building this thing. So we were using a number of different software platforms that you may use in your studios, this being 3D Studio Max to build the geometry. And this was sort of a long process where we surveyed points and collected them into a digital workspace. And then we overlaid all of the photographic information that had been taken and tried to basically achieve in the digital world what was already there in current state on site. So this was really about spreading the genius loci on site with the rest of the world so that you here in Bozeman might be able to get into the digital model and see what we see there. But beyond that, there were so many other opportunities, because once you have a digital model and you have the ability to texture it, and you have those reconstructed images that I showed you earlier, now you have the opportunity to not only do what's current state, but also do an imagined reconstructed state. And that's the first thing we did. What we've since found is that there's not just one reconstructed state. There were actually many phases of this villa and many different aspects to it, and that one of the things that we could do in a digital workspace is have multiple overlays. And I'll show later that it doesn't just exist in the digital workspace, but now with the advent of virtual reality and augmented reality in particular, you can now overlay digital information into a physical world. And that is probably the most exciting part of this. So this is one of the renderings that you saw earlier. I will just note that in this, the model did serve a performative or analytical purpose, because I was saying they had to build roofs over many of these rooms, even garden rooms and atria, to protect the frescoes. So when you're there, the lighting conditions actually are not necessarily correct. And the digital model allowed us to strip those roofs off and track the sun and actually see the way that the sun and the shadow moved across the wall. So this room, you can see that the brightness coming through from one of the garden rooms. Here also another reconstruction that really goes way beyond what's in current state. In fact, this stone, as John mentioned, is not even on site anymore. We only have traces of stone. but through the research of our stone guy and collaboration with several scholars, we were able to piece this together and make this image. So, as a side note, I do want to describe some quality of this building that I really found, I was surprised by and really inspired by as an architect. We think about classical architecture often as the city courthouse, the white facade, symmetrical arrangements. And even though you see many of those aspects in our villa with symmetry, with Roman ornament, I was actually surprised to find, having not really studied this myself, that internal to that are all sorts of different spaces. I mean, these guys were really good, and they were doing things that were very modern in our conception of that term. So in one example of that, this room, this sort of collection of 2 rooms had a series of windows that were aligned with a little bird on the far wall. And when you're in that space and you get the right alignment, that bird at the end is framed. And I think that's a great example of how Romans used multiple decorative elements together to achieve an effect. And I want to emphasize that it was necessary to have that multiplicity of architecture and painting and sculpture, because that's what they were doing. That was their process of design. That was the end result. And when you take something by itself, if I were to just take the architecture of it, the walls, I am not fully representing or reanimating the space that it was. So one of our challenges, my challenges, has been to overlay multiple decorative elements and try to find that, again, genius loci or spirit that might have been there originally. So one of the ways we used the model was to make a navigable 3D model. This was with Unity 3D software. That's one of the main gaming platforms that's used for a lot of different games. Obviously removing the gun, but still having a very immersive experience where you can move around, you can jump, you can interact actually with walls, and also move through time with different daylighting. So check that out in the show. It's just a screenshot of that, and this is one of the rooms where we have a roof, and by removing that, we now have more accurate lighting conditions. And we could also add plants to this so we get filtered light and explore all of those things. Okay, another thing to do with the digital model, and this truly is a tangent that I did mostly for my own amusement, was to take that digital model, the textured model, exactly as it is in 3ds Max or Unity, and sending it to a 3D printer. And the technology is there, so you don't really have to do any extra work. Once you have a digital model, you can then produce physical prototypes. Now, scaling is an issue because it's still somewhat expensive to 3D print, but I did a few tests, color 3D powder prints that exhibited some of these spaces and wall surfaces. So those are 2 examples. Okay, so another use of the model that unfortunately you can't experience here, but we hope to get this out in the world when the technology is there. But the same digital model in Unity 3D can be put onto an Oculus Rift for a full virtual reality experience. So you put on this headset, and you move your head and you look around, and you can move forward and back. And I experienced that for the first time actually in Michigan, which is a real privilege. It's something I'll tell my grandchildren about. The first time with the headset, and they'll laugh, but because it's going to change the world. But in this case, it was for me a way. It changed my perspective on the space, because I view this model many times, but always on a screen, and to be able to interact with it in a corporal way is really special. In addition to that, Oculus Rift. In Michigan, they also have a cave environment. I don't know if you have one in Montana, but these are spaces with sort of 6 surfaces with projections on them, but you have a head tracker. So as you move around, the projections are changing. So it's also, you would call it virtual reality, but it's a little less claustrophobic, and it's also a spectator sport. So this is our archaeologist, Ivo van der Graaf, exploring the space at his leisure. And you can see his little antenna, and they're tracking his head movement. And the image here looks blurry, but to him it's actually very clear because it's a 3D image with 3D glasses. So he's exploring the East Wing. And I did this as well, and it's very, very convincing. So if you ever have an opportunity to jump inside a cave environment, I recommend it. Okay. So another topic is sculpture. This one involves laser scanning. So in the archives, we see the moment when they excavated these. We have photographs from the one day that these sculptures were on site, really where they were meant to be. But after that, they went into the storeroom for protection, and they were there for, we say, I guess, 45 years. And it actually took me 4 years working with this team to ever get into that room, because it's often locked. And it was only when we started planning this show that Elaine showed up on site, we got the keys, and all of a sudden we were in this space. And learning something new about the villa and seeing a whole aspect of that decorative ensemble that I really wasn't aware of. So there's sculpture that would have been all around the villa, aligned with certain views and pathways. And without them, I think we really have only a partial understanding of the space. So this is the Deposito with those metal racks that Elaine mentioned. And then this is that laser scanning process conducted by Marcus Abbott to get this geometry. And that allowed us to add these sculptures back into the Unity model. So that's where they are. But that's sort of where we stopped, I think, with the project and the exhibition. But again, there are a lot of opportunities here. So just think about this particular sculpture. On the left, you see a photo in sight. Then you see it in storage. Then you see a rendered 3D scan. And on the right is my desk with this apparition through the Augment app, which is available for free on the App Store. So we can, once we have this content, the digital content, it's much easier to share it with the world. And through simple tools like geotagging and scaling, you can put this back into the world. And the clearest example of that is Pokemon Go, right? So this is the first big application of augmented reality, but clearly a preview of what's to come. So I imagine that we'll get our sculpture in here someday. Okay. Okay, so my last little vignette is dealing with Cubiculum 11, which you are familiar with if you've seen the show. This was really Elaine's dream, and when she asked me to do it, I didn't think it was practical. but we pushed ahead, and we figured out a way to build this. So here it is. It's a second-style room in the southwest of the excavated portion of the villa. And it's a particularly important room because just in that one room, you have all of these decorative elements. And this is something that John Clark wrote about in his early days in the villa. But just in this room, you have wall painting, you have stucco, oftentimes aligning with those painted elements. You have really a beautiful floor with what are called scendiletti or scendiletto that's a strip. And that's aligned with a piece of furniture that would have been aligned with this alcove. So all those elements work together, and it was important not to skip any of them, right? Because we wouldn't have been able to demonstrate the full character. So there you get another view. And the other thing to note is that we, as I guess as art historians or archaeologists, often think that we are doing the preserving. And in some instances we are. I think in many other instances we're doing a bit of destruction as well. Just by having this open, in open air, there is a fairly fast process of deterioration over time. So this photo on the left from 40 years ago shows detail in one of the upper paintings under the vault. And on the right is a more recent photo that's color, but now lacks all of that detail. So our project team has dealt with all of this input of information. And oftentimes you have to take something from the past or some written archival element and tie it together with new visual information or new scientific information, and then try to blend those together to have a more accurate vision. So with this one, that's the original photo, and then it was actually recolorized with some of the color pigment information from the modern photograph. This is another aspect of my work on it. We're taking photographs that are kind of messy and trying to reconstruct these. So going in and really kind of making my own mosaic. But these are pretty accurate. Making a whole new floor. I'll just speed through this. Taking the vaults, you can see on the left, it's a little hard to tell what's going on, but when you really study it, you can find that original pigment and then expand it. And same with the walls. And in this case, it was interesting that there was a door that was a door in antiquity, but it was cut at a later phase. So this particular room we wanted to represent in its original phase. So we actually removed that door. This is the pragmatic side, making sure this can fit in a gallery space, and then planning all the constituent parts and who's going to build what and how you're going to apply all of the elements. Preparing the boards that are printed, and then trying to get ahead. Let's see. Okay, so we also used 3D scanning here. This helped us recreate the cornices in a more accurate way. Okay, we're having trouble getting ahead here. Okay, so there are also analog approaches too. So if you're a person who likes to draw, there's still a role for you. Oftentimes that sort of personal interaction with a piece reveals something that a 3D scan might not. So there's a bit of both happening on site even today. And then this is preparation for milling, finding all of the unique profiles and sort of cataloging them, and then preparing cut sheets. So this is the built version, and then this is the laid out on a big cut sheet. And this will show you how it works. On the left, you see the drill bit moving. This is all pre-programmed, and it's cutting the surface. Oftentimes in 2 passes, you'll do a rough cut, and then you'll do a very refined cut, and you can get a very good surface. And then on the right, you see just the way this machine works. You have to vacuum up all the debris. So this was fun for me because it brings together what is a fairly new technology to say something about the past that would have been hard to do. It would have been hard to build this in stucco, cost prohibitive, so to speak. Okay, so these are the tests, and then one of the end result of these arches that you'll see in the show. And this is during the build in Michigan. So you can see how those elements work together. The cornice is aligned with the fresco, and then right down to the floor where it aligns with the scendiletto. Okay, so back to this image. I shared a few examples of how we move through this process of documentation, of analysis, of sort of recreation and reanimation. And the result is really this show. I think it's an amazing product. I think it really does have some piece of that spirit. I would argue also the catalog is a great representation of the villa and the ebook and all of that. I think that's not the final ending point of this. So I have my last little arrow dotted, but how could this information that we've revealed, that we've uncovered, be reinserted or reanimate the actual physical space? And how can we tie these things together? So that's sort of the ultimate challenge, I think, for our team, that we continue to try to do with the digital model. But as technology improves, I think there's some real opportunities ahead. So a final thank you to the Aplantis project team, the Texans. They have been great. This is an image from a few years ago when they were just exploring the Milano area, which is on the south side of that canal. And it's just amazing how these things come together. But I remember going in there the first time, and someone sort of picked at the wall and found a little tesserae, and basically thought, this is the extension of a floor we already have. And based on that assumption and the work of Giovanni Di Maio, there was sort of a hypothesis put together that this was the stepping structure, and now we'll see later this afternoon that they've actually uncovered that stuff. So there's a process of discovery that's happening on-site, but also off-site here and on our laptops, and really all over the world when scholars engage with this content online. So thank you. I'm looking forward to questions when we do that.